I didn't want to speak from a pulpit today. I kind of don't even want to be in front of everyone, but I'll accept this. My name is Caitlin. I realized maybe some of you don't know my name. I just sort of assume that everybody knows me. My name is Caitlin, and I've been coming to the place for I think around 2 decades now. And my ancestry is English and Scottish, British, and I'm I guess, second generation immigrant on one side. My father, or is that first generation? Anyway, my father immigrated from Scotland as an adult, and on my mother's side, it was her parents' generation that came to Canada from that side. So that's kind of my cultural location, ancestral location, and I think it's really important to be really clear about that. I'll touch on that a little bit later. But so a decade ago, this movement started to recognize September 30th as Orange Shirt Day, and probably most of us by now are familiar with the story of Phyllis Webstad, the residential school survivor, and her shiny new orange shirt that she wore on her first day of residential school and then was taken away from her. And then, as we know, a couple of years ago, the Government of Canada declared September 30th as National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And that was in fulfillment of one of the calls to action of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was released in 2015. And this day is meant to serve as a public commemoration of the history and the legacy of residential schools. And so between essentially the late 1800s and 1996, over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children attended residential schools in this country. So with September 30th coming up, I was asked if I would speak today and quote unquote share my wisdom about a topic that quite frankly I have no business claiming any wisdom about, given my cultural background. But the request did get me thinking about wisdom and about how one aspect of the impact of residential schools is the role that they played in disrupting the flow of wisdom and knowledge in Indigenous communities in an effort to extinguish Indigenous ways of knowing and ways of life. In many Indigenous communities, knowledge and wisdom are shared very relationally through story and ceremony, and residential schools were designed to sever those relationships through which traditional wisdom was shared and to indoctrinate children with Christian European education. If we're not going to mince words, the intent was cultural genocide. And of course, the impact was and continues to be profound, as Christiana mentioned. Communities have lost immeasurable cultural and linguistic knowledge. Families have been robbed of generations. We have a vague estimate that maybe about 6,000 children died in residential schools. Let's just pause and let that sink in. Conservative estimate, 6,000 children never came home. And also, as Christiana mentioned, this isn't in some distant past. Phyllis Webstad is only 16 years older than I am. And yet, Indigenous knowledge and wisdom persist. Communities are working hard to reconnect with that wisdom and to revitalize languages and stories and ceremonies. And even in the face of continued discrimination and oppression, some Indigenous people are choosing to share their wisdom with a world that, it's increasingly obvious, to me anyway, needs to hear it. So, what I decided that I wanted for us to do today as a community, rather than to focus on the devastation caused by the residential school system, though that is important to acknowledge, and rather than listen to me talk about cultures or traditions that aren't my own, is I want us to listen to and reflect on some wisdom shared by Indigenous people from North America, or what is sometimes called Turtle Island. I believe that this wisdom comes from the same source as all the best wisdom that we find in the Christian tradition and in other spiritual traditions. And my hope is that we can listen with open hearts, and that our hearts might be transformed and spurred to action. Because we often hear the word reconciliation used to talk about finding a path forward together for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And Jody Wilson-Raybould recently wrote a book called True Reconciliation. Jody Wilson-Raybould is the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and comes from the Kwakwaka'wakw people of northern Vancouver Island. I did look up that pronunciation and I tried my best. So in True Reconciliation, she shared her perspective that reconciliation involves three practices: to learn, to understand, and to act. And so I sort of just hope that our time together today can be an opportunity for us to begin to practice those things. So I'm just going to share a couple of excerpts. My sort of plan was initially to share like a few different things in different formats, but I actually just decided that I'd rather share a couple of longer excerpts so that we can kind of get a little deeper into them and appreciate them a little more. And then as we listen to each one, if you'd like, like I said, there's paper and pencils at the back. If you'd like to grab something to just write down any reflections on, you can do that. And after I finish each excerpt, I'd actually like for us to reflect on them together. So I'll maybe just give a minute or two for you to reflect, and then I'll open the floor, and I'm hoping that we can share any reflections that we have. And I don't want to give a lot of direction in terms of the content of the discussion. I'll just ask that we share thoughtfully and respectfully, obviously. It's totally okay to not understand or to have questions, and I think it's also important to recognize that we're reflecting on these ideas from our own locations. Like I was saying, from where I'm from, we can be aware that we're reflecting on these ideas and this wisdom kind of as outsiders, right? And obviously this exercise doesn't offer the same opportunity for understanding as like in-person relationships do, but I also think it's important for non-Indigenous people to put in the work ourselves to start learning about the richness of Indigenous cultures. So that's kind of my point today. And then we'll wrap up with just a quick look at some of the ways that we might think about taking action towards reconciliation in our daily lives. And just a quick note too, before I begin, I say cultures and traditions, and I think we're all aware of this, but because it's really important to understand that there are like many, many distinct Indigenous cultures and identities across North America. So I'm very aware that the excerpts that I'm reading today just represent a couple of those, right? And there are many, many more. So the first excerpt I'm going to read is taken from a book that's called Saltwater People. And it records some of the teachings of the late Wasanich elder Dave Elliott Sr., who was also instrumental in the revitalization of the Sanchothan language of the Wasanich people. So the Wasanich people's territory includes the Saanich Peninsula north of the Coles or Mount Doug and Goldstream, as well as the Malahat and the Southern Gulf Islands and San Juan Islands, and even across the Georgia Strait to Boundary Bay. So this is from Dave Elliott Sr. Our people lived as part of everything. We were so much a part of nature. We were just like the birds, the animals, the fish. We were like the mountains. Our people lived that way. We knew there was an intelligence, a strength, a power far beyond ourselves. We knew that everything here didn't just happen by accident. We believed there was a reason for it being here. There was a force, a strength, a power somewhere that was responsible for it. That is the way our people lived. They lived according to that belief, according to that knowledge. The universe lies before you. We don't know anything about it. Very few people know anything about the universe. We know it's big, we know it's vast, we know it's full of everything, planets and suns and other bodies of different kinds. That is the universe, and we're part of that universe, and our people knew that. They knew that, and they respected that. Our people lived for each other. They believed that everybody had the same right as the other one. Everybody had the right to comfort, to security, the right to food, a home, the use of the land. This is because we believed that everything was put here by a great and wonderful intelligence. Other people have different names. Some of you call him God, and some other names. We believed that power, that strength, that great intelligence was so far beyond us that we were comparable to the insects that crawl on the ground, or even the pebbles that lie on the beach. This was how far lesser we were than that great intelligence that was responsible for everything that was here and responsible for that vast universe out there. Nobody knows where the end is. Nobody knows where the beginning is. This is knowledge our people had. They knew that, and this is why we lived in such a beautiful way. This is why they respected each other. This is why they were so honest. They did not say anything to hurt the character of their neighbor. They believed whatever was here had a right to live, even to the insects that walked on the ground. The trees, birds, animals, rivers, lakes. Our people respected everything. They would not waste. If they took something, they used every bit of it. If they killed a fish, they ate the whole thing, the head, the tail, the gills, the liver, the milt, the roe. They ate it all, every bit of it. When they returned the bare bones to the water, they gave thanks to the Creator for having provided for them. They would not cut down a living tree unless they had to. When they had to cut a living tree down, they would go to the tree and address it by its sacred name. They would tell the tree how sorry they were to have to take its life, but their need was so great that they had to take it. When you cut a tree down, you kill it, and you take its life. They used every bit, every scrap of an animal. The hide, the bones, the hoofs, every scrap of that animal was usable. If it was a deer or a moose, there was nothing left but the bare head. Then they would take it and burn the head. They would burn it so that it would not lie around disrespectfully. Far different from seeing the head fastened to the wall so the dead animal stares down at you. I remember as a little boy, I would want to play with a duck somebody had brought home from the hunting. I guess I thought it was pretty and I'd want to play with it. My mother would raise her voice to me and say, "Leave it alone, it's dead." She was telling me to show respect for that creature whose life we had taken for food. Our people now have lost a lot of this. We had a good way of life, a beautiful way of life, I guess because it came from an understanding of the very basis of this life we live. They respected everything that was here, they kept everything clean, they did not spoil anything, they did not overexploit anything. They saw to it that unfortunate people had their share as well. When a young hunter or a young fisherman returned from hunting or fishing, the old ladies would be already sitting on the beach waiting for his return. When he landed, they walked down with their baskets and they picked out the choicest fish, the choicest ducks, or whatever he had, and the young man sat in the stern of his canoe and was very pleased with his old people. He thanked them and they blessed him. This was the kind of people we were. This is the way we lived. We believe it was wrong to be greedy. Greed was unknown amongst our people. We have no word for it in our language. I believe our people walked hand in hand with the Creator. Some people call him the Creator, the Great Spirit. We believed that everything that was here was put here for our use. That's why our people respected everything and believed everything had a right to live, just like we did. So I'll just give us a minute to reflect a little more on that. We're just starting these conversations, so we don't need to come to any conclusions, but it's not easy. And I think sometimes we idealize the past, and it wasn't perfect, right? We know that. But there's wisdom to be had there. The second excerpt is from a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. It was written in 2013 by a very wise woman named Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is, quote, a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Potawatomi Nation. The Potawatomi people originally lived in the Great Lakes region, but were actually forcibly removed from their territory around, I think, 1830 to what is now Kansas and Oklahoma. That forced migration came to be known as the Trail of Death because so many people died along the way. I've read a couple of Dr. Kimmerer's books now, and I would recommend reading anything she writes. She's just an amazing writer as well as being really, really wise, so it's just always a pleasure to read her words. And I'm going to read her telling of her people's creation story and some of her reflections on it. It's called Sky Woman Falling. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear, or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below, but in that emptiness there were many eyes gazing up at the sudden shaft of light. They saw there a small object, a mere dust mote in the beam. As it grew closer, they could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled toward them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. Far from the only home she'd ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward. And so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather: loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water and agreed to go find some. Loon dove first, but the distance was too far, and after a long while he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help: otter, beaver, sturgeon, but the depth, the darkness, and the pressures were too great for even the strongest of swimmers. They returned gasping for air, with their heads ringing. Some did not return at all. Soon, only little Muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He volunteered to go, while the others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone a very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative, and before long, a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of the muskrat. He had given his life to aid this helpless human. But then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back and I will hold it." Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, from the dab of mud on Turtle's back until the whole earth was made. Not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all the animals' gifts, coupled with her deep gratitude. Together they formed what we know today as Turtle Island, our home. Like any good guest, Sky Woman had not come empty-handed. The bundle was still clutched in her hand. When she toppled from the hole in the sky world, she had reached out to grab onto the tree of life that grew there. In her grasp were branches, fruits, and seeds of all kinds of plants. These she scattered onto the new ground and carefully tended each one until the world turned from brown to green. Sunlight streamed through the hole from the sky world, allowing the seeds to flourish. Wild grasses, flowers, trees, and medicines spread everywhere. And now that the animals too had plenty to eat, many came to live with her on Turtle Island. Our stories say that of all the plants, sweetgrass was the very first to grow on the earth, its fragrance a sweet memory of Sky Woman's hand. Accordingly, it is honored as one of the 4 sacred plants of my people. Breathe in its scent and you start to remember things you didn't know you'd forgotten. Our elders say that ceremonies are the way we remember to remember. And so sweetgrass is a powerful ceremonial plant cherished by many Indigenous nations. It is also used to make beautiful baskets. Both medicine and a relative, its value is both material and spiritual. There is such tenderness in braiding the hair of someone you love. Kindness and something more flow between the braider and the braided, the two connected by the cord of the plait. Sweetgrass waves in strands, long and shining like a woman's freshly washed hair, and so we say it is the flowing hair of Mother Earth. When we braid sweetgrass, we are braiding the hair of Mother Earth, showing her our loving attention, our care for her beauty and well-being, in gratitude for all she has given us. Children hearing the Sky Woman story from birth know in their bones the responsibility that flows between humans and the earth. The story of Sky Woman's journey is so rich and glittering, it feels to me like a deep bowl of celestial blue from which I could drink again and again. It holds our beliefs, our history, our relationships. Looking into that starry bowl, I see images swirling so fluidly that the past and the present become as one. Images of Sky Woman speak not just of where we came from, but also of how we can go forward. It is good to remember that the original woman was herself an immigrant. She fell a long way from her home in the sky world, leaving behind all who knew her and who held her dear. She could never go back. Since 1492, most here are immigrants as well, perhaps arriving on Ellis Island without even knowing that Turtle Island rested beneath their feet. Some of my ancestors are Sky Woman's people, and I belong to them. Some of my ancestors were the newer kind of immigrants too, a French fur trader, an Irish carpenter, a Welsh farmer. And here we all are on Turtle Island trying to make a home. Their stories of arrivals with empty pockets and nothing but hope resonate with Sky Woman's. She came here with nothing but a handful of seeds and the slimmest of instructions to use your gifts and dreams for good, the same instructions we all carry. She accepted the gifts from the other beings with open hands and used them honorably. She shared the gifts she brought from Skyworld as she set herself about the business of flourishing, of making a home. In the public arena, I've heard the Sky Woman story told as a bauble of colorful folklore, but even when it is misunderstood, there is power in the telling. Most of my students have never heard the origin story of this land where they were born, but when I tell them, something begins to kindle behind their eyes. Can we all understand the Sky Woman story not as an artifact from the past, but as instructions for the future? Can a nation of immigrants once again follow her example to become native, to make a home? Dr. Kimura actually talks more about that idea of like becoming, the word that she would use is naturalized. So like talking about it kind of the way that plants, there are plants that are introduced to a place and take over and become invasive. But there are also plants that are introduced to a place and find a way to coexist and to, share their gifts as well. And we call those plants naturalized. They're not invasive, but they're also not indigenous to the land that they're on, but they're naturalized. They've become part of the ecosystem in a way that's not harmful. And I really like that concept as applied to us as well. Like, you know what? It's not that we're all expected to leave and like not make our home here, but it's how we make our home here. Dr. Kimura also reflects on in a different passage, the differences between that creation story and the Christian creation story and the two women, and it's interesting. So I'll move us along. I'd rather not, but obviously the opportunities for us to take action are varied, and like there's really no limit on how we can choose to change the way that we're living or contribute to finding that path forward. But I just sort of picked a few ideas. I think it's really important, if we are able to contribute financially to kind of this effort that a lot of communities are starting to make to reconnect with their cultures, in recognition that like we did mess it up. Our arrival here really did disconnect a lot of that, and so it would be great if we can contribute to the rebuilding of that and the reconnection there. So just a few ideas there, but some of them local. So the Victoria Native Friendship Centre, the Husanich Nations are doing a lot of rebuilding, and so there's a few different things that they're doing, but one of the things that's fairly new is they have a lands trust, and so they're actually able to receive gifts of land, of actual land being given back to their community. And then obviously the Indian Residential School Survivor Society is a great way to contribute, and the Orange Shirt Society. There's again, just a small list of other resources that you could read that I would really recommend if you haven't already. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's available on the internet. You can find it by Googling it, and the whole text is available there. It's just a really helpful perspective to have on what's happening internationally. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, so the Canadian Commission, that their report came out in 2015. Read that. Read all the calls to action. It's pretty obvious that there's a lot still to do. A really great book that I just read recently was Unsettling Canada. It's by Arthur Manuel, and it sort of tells the story of his family's involvement in a lot of the activism for Indigenous rights in Canada from several decades ago till now. And it's really well written, super interesting. He's a great storyteller. So that was a really great read. And then there's a fellow called Jared Kwastenachan Williams, who's from Cowichan, who is, he writes on The Discourse, which is like an online sort of periodical, but also is on Instagram and all the kind of socials. And he's just super wise, and also a really, he comes from the perspective of Indigenous food systems. He was a chef, and he just has a lot of interesting things to say about the importance of food to Indigenous cultures and building back up Indigenous food systems. And then just other things, try to support Indigenous artists and musicians and businesses. One of my favorite businesses in town is the Songhees Food Truck, delicious food. They are over just off of Admirals and Craigflower. The truck is just there all the time, just right by the reserve. So it's like Admirals Walk in that area. And then we can try to help to heal the land just like ecologically as well, right? We can acknowledge that our arrival also did a lot of damage there. So Habitat Acquisition Trust is a local environmental stewardship organization that is also working quite well with local First Nations and helping them to restore land of theirs, and so that's a great option. And then obviously we can do some advocating, right? We can advocate for the changes that need to happen in terms of policy and in terms of, like the criminal justice system and the foster care system, and even more locally, there are some municipalities that are starting to work on giving options for some of our, what is it called? Tax on your land, property tax, to be given back to communities. So that is only happening, I think, in like a couple of places, but we could be advocating for more of that. And I think one of the things that Jody Wilson-Raybould said in her book was just the important thing is to be consistent, right? It's like, if you're able, try to make like regular donations a thing in your life, and you know, it's kind of like, oh, around this time of year we all start thinking about it, and we're like, yeah, I should do that, but let's try to actually be having those conversations over dinner and just bringing it into our lives a little bit more consistently. Yeah. So anyway, I'm really grateful that this community is talking about these things, and I just hope that as individuals and as a community, we can commit to doing this consistently, to continuing to learn and to understand and to act on a consistent basis, and hopefully find that path forward that's healing for all of us.